Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this PRI webinar on the usability of the EU's proposed taxonomy, or as it's officially named, the EU's Unified Classification System for Environmentally Sustainable Economic Activities. Up on the screen you can see an agenda. I'm going to start today by introducing our panel and giving a bit of information on how you can participate in today's webinar. And we'll then be exploring the context for the taxonomy. I'm then going to hand over to my expert speakers. They're going to be digging into the details of the taxonomy in a bit more detail, and in particular they're going to be focusing on how you can give your views on making the taxonomy a really useful tool for investors. To start off with, we have two really excellent speakers today. Helena Fiestas from BNP Paribas is responsible for the research policy and stewardship activities on sustainability at BNP Paribas, and is Deputy Head of Sustainability. She plays a critical role in the design, development, and implementation of the firm's global sustainability strategy. She represents the firm on the AFAMA Committee on Stewardship and ESG, is a board member of the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, and sits on a number of committees, including the Sustainable Stock Exchange Green Finance Advisory Group, the PRI Policy Reference Group, and the Technical Advisory Group of the LSE-led Transition Pathway Initiative. We also have Brenda Kramer, who works as a Senior Advisor on Responsible Investment at the Dutch asset manager PGGM. She's a core member of the Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, the GRESB Infrastructure Advisory Board. Brenda previously worked for more than 10 years as a strategic advisor for the Dutch Finance Minister and the President of the Eurogroup, and so has a deep expertise on European legislation and politics. And at PGGM, Brenda works on the integration of sustainability in PGGM's infrastructure fund, so driven by the ambition to create positive impact alongside financial returns. Both Brenda and Helena are key members of the Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance and are participating very actively in developing the taxonomy. So they are really right at the heart of developments and are in a position to give us a really good overview today. And to introduce myself, I'm moderating today's session. My name is Alyssa Heath. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the PRI, and I lead the PRI's European and UK policy engagement. So we've been actively engaging in EU policy since 2015. We engage on a number of different legislative files and also some of the non-legislative developments. And you may be aware as well that the PRI's Chief Responsible Investment Officer, Nathan Fabian, is chairing the Taxonomy Working Group of the Technical Expert Group, and we are supporting that within the policy team at PRI. So a quick note before we start on how you can get involved in today's webinar. We've had a really exceptionally high level of interest in today's webinar, which is fantastic. We're really thrilled to have everybody here. But due to the very high number of participants, we're going to have to keep people on mute throughout the webinar. So please share your questions via the chat function. You can see on the screen how you can access that, and we'll try to answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. And if we can't answer them, then the policy team at PRI will try and reach out to you directly to give you a direct answer. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on the overall context for the taxonomy before we really dive into the details. The slide on your screen actually originates from the European Commission, and I've put it here to demonstrate that sustainable finance has grown in importance in recent years to the extent that it's now considered one of the 4 pillars of EU sustainability policy, alongside climate and energy policy, environment policy, and investment and growth policy, which in this context is principally about EU budgets. And underpinning these 4 pillars is the long-term strategy to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. This is a very ambitious document that was released at the end of 2018, and it recognizes the critical role of sustainable finance and also the taxonomy in transitioning to a carbon neutral economy in Europe by 2050. And the European Commission has issued in early 2018 an action plan on financing sustainable growth. And as you can see from the slide, it has 3 critical objectives: reorienting capital flows towards sustainable investment, mainstreaming sustainability into risk management, and fostering transparency and long-termism. And the taxonomy was the top recommendation of that action plan. And the taxonomy is seen as critical, really because it will give a clear shared understanding of what a high standard of environmental sustainability will look like, and it helps to draw attention to the types of activities that will be needed to finance the low carbon economy. Now, there are a further 9 actions in the action plan. Today's focus is on the taxonomy, and given the richness in that discussion, we won't be spending a lot of time on these other issues. But I just wanted to put this here to emphasize that this is part of a major push to mainstream sustainable finance and is looking at all aspects of capital markets. So the progress on the taxonomy has taken 2 strands. The European Commission released a draft regulation which set out the overall framework for how the taxonomy would be developed, and also sets out the governance of the taxonomy long term by establishing a sustainable finance platform. That's the kind of overarching regulatory framework, but then the technical work was kicked off through the Technical Expert Group. The Technical Expert Group was established in June 2018 and has been tasked with developing technical screening criteria for the EU Taxonomy, as well as an EU Green Bond Standard, minimum standards for the methodology of low carbon indices, and finally a report which you may have seen that's already been issued on improving disclosure on climate-related information. So it's that technical work that we'll be discussing today, and I'm very pleased to have 2 TEG members to speak. Before I hand over to them, I did just want to mention that the PRI is monitoring or engaging on quite a lot of the elements of the overall action plan. We have an active program of engaging in EU policy, and we very much welcome the opportunity to share information with PRI signatories, to exchange views, to get input on potential policy positions, and really just to have an open exchange of ideas around what the reforms in place should look like. So I would really like to encourage you to get in touch if this is an area you're interested in. My details are on the screen. We're always happy to have a discussion about sustainable finance policy at the EU level. And with that, I think I'm delighted to hand over to our next speaker.
Hello, good morning to everyone, and thank you so much. It is important to keep in mind where the taxonomy fits within the EC action plan. So as you said, the taxonomy real aim is to contribute to reorientate capital flows from fossil fuel, non-environmental, to low carbon and environmental sustainable investments. And that is what within the EC action plan is the #1 objective. And it aims to do that, the taxonomy, by identifying those activities that are really environmentally sustainable, as you were saying, Alyssa. So in other words, it does not identify ESG risks or ESG practices. It does not define at all what ESG is. Neither does it classify or identify environmental companies. Instead, it very much looks at activity level and which ones are environmentally sustainable. It aims, therefore, to help finance in the transition to a low carbon and a more environmental economic model. That is to meet that famous figure that we've been all hearing about, the 270 billion gap of additional investments per year that the EU needs to meet its 2030 and 2050 climate and more broadly environmental, very ambitious goals. So as Alyssa was also saying, there is a legal proposal, and I just want to very quickly point out to 2 things that the actual legal proposal says. So first, it is that it does require what for me are basically 3 requirements for any activity to be eligible to the taxonomy. That is that it has to first and foremost contribute substantially to at least one of the 6 environmental objectives that we're going to look at in a second. Secondly, it cannot significantly harm any of the other environmental objectives, so the overall impact has to be positive. And what the taxonomy is going to define also is why and under which circumstances. So that means that it will have to comply with quantitative where possible, but also qualitative technical screening criteria. Now, what you can see in your slide is the fourth requirement, that's the C. Well, the fourth requirement is not really to be able to comply, to be eligible as an activity to the taxonomy, but more that is when the actual activity will be carried out, that is when a company conducts that activity, then the company will have to ensure that it complies with minimum social safeguards. As of today, the legal proposal only includes labor rights. We have been pushing for the inclusion of human rights, and the PRI has been very supportive as well. And in other words, what this means is that all of us as investors, when we will be investing in an activity that is part of the taxonomy, we will have to conduct labor and hopefully human rights due diligence. As I was saying, there are 6 environmental objectives. Those, you have them in front of you. Those are the 6 environmental objectives that are part of the EU environmental plans. We are currently a strategic plan, so we're currently running the 7th ones. And they are climate mitigation and adaptation, and then sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, then the circular economy, waste prevention and recycling, pollution prevention and control, and last but not least, protection of healthy ecosystems. So what you have to think about is, imagine a Excel spreadsheet where you have on one hand a whole list of activities, and then you have at the rows you would have the 6 objectives. So what we will be looking at is, let's first concentrate on mitigation. Does this activity contribute substantially to mitigate climate change? Yes or no, and then under which circumstances, or whether and what type of technical criteria we can put in place to ensure that actually that activity contributes substantially to mitigation, to reduce significantly CO2. But then we will then check that that activity does not harm any of the other 5 objectives in this case, and under which circumstances it might actually harm those objectives. So, for me, I like to think of the taxonomy as a dictionary, a dictionary that we can all look up. So, and where we can find the exact definition, that is, the exact circumstances and context in which an activity is considered environmentally sustainable. It is not, and this is very important, a mandatory list to invest in. It's not a standard or an exclusion list. A standard would be a label. And I just want to share with everyone in this call, for those that might not have been following, but the European Commission, the EU, is developing an Ecolabel. The first consultation finished on the January 25th, but there will be further consultations along the line. So it's something to keep an eye on. So what is the intention of the, why is it so positive, the taxonomy? The first and foremost, it's probably because it aims to finish with disagreements, different views of what environmental sustainable is. Different views that can be within the same company. We have realizing how many financial institutions use different taxonomies in different departments. It's also to set up a harmonized, view across the market, but also between countries. I don't need to stress, to all of you how different views different countries within the EU have, is nuclear sustainable or not, and we can go on the list. So that will hopefully really facilitate and encourage, investments throughout the value chain, the financial value chain, but also inter-country. from my perspective, it would really help us all to save a lot of time and resources. I mean, to keep a real thorough and sound taxonomy, it is hard work. It means that you have a pretty big team inside that that keeps pace of all the changes and all the science that is out there. Not to say that when you look at the level of scientific backing that the taxonomy is going to have and is having, we realize that this is no task really for the financial sector. I would like to really stress, what the legal text says about the only legally binding, if you wish, or mandatory uses of the taxonomy. The taxonomy is only compulsory to refer to for all those financial market participants that want to market a product as environmentally friendly or green. So if you want to call your fund green, then you will have to refer to the taxonomy. And we'll see later on exactly what that means. But it would also be compulsory for member states to refer to the taxonomy when they themselves set out any type of requirements on market actors in relationship to financial products that are marketed or deemed to be environmentally sustainable. I don't want to spend too long on all the nitty-gritty aspects of the taxonomy, but wanted to highlight just a few that I believe are quite important. So the first one is that we're not only focusing on purely green sectors, but also we're setting thresholds to enable the greening of polluting sectors. So that is, when we look at the majority of today's green funds out there, it actually expands the investment universe. It is also really important to find that there are two very key characteristics of the taxonomy that they're going to be central to the taxonomy when it's put in place. The first one is the dynamic character. That is, the taxonomy is not a fixed dictionary. It evolves organically to take into account all the new developments and innovations, both from a science and technological point of view, but also from a policy perspective. And this is why, when you look at the legal text, what the Commission proposes is to establish a sustainability platform, which will be made of, it will be a multi-stakeholder representatives that will be in charge of ensuring that dynamism. So they will be the ones that will have to ensure that the taxonomy keeps, it's updated. They will be the ones that will oversight that taxonomy, and most likely, or maybe potentially, they will also look at developing a social taxonomy. What is important for everyone to remember or to think about is that that sustainability platform and the governance and the process that will be set up, that platform is probably as important, if not more important, than the taxonomy that will come out at the end of June. So it's something for all of us to keep an eye on and to remember that the taxonomy will definitely be dynamic. The other thing that I think it's really important to remember is that the taxonomy needs to find the right balance between being granular enough to minimize ambiguity about what greenness is and to be scientifically sound, but at the same time flexible enough for all of us to use it so that it becomes operational and to cater to technological and market developments. So when looking at it, please keep that in mind. And last but not least, to remember that whatever is not included, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's brown. For instance, we will not look into pharmaceuticals, so like the development of medicines, because they're simply not an environmental activity. Before I hand over to Brenda, I wanted to show you just how this dictionary would look like. So imagine this is, you will have what you have in front of you, but replicated, a number of times with different sectors. So you will have the macro sector, then you will have the description of, let's call it subsector or subactivity at the lowest activity level that we're looking at. You will then see what the mitigation criteria is and whether or not there is a threshold, and if there is, what that threshold is. In this case, the metric is greenhouse gas emissions, so grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt, and the threshold has been established at 125 grams. You also have at the very bottom of your slide the explanation and additional notes, that explain you how and why we reached that conclusion. In the middle, you have the do not significant harm assessment. Now, this is really important for us investors because I don't know about your own taxonomies, but the taxonomy that we developed internally at BNP Paribas Asset Management, we had not only the activities that were included and why, but then we had part of in our assessment, what were the key ESG risks that activity entail. In this case, what we would have is very concrete science-based explanations and note of what are the potential environmental downsides or secondary effects, if you wish. So without any further delay, I'll pass over to Brenda.
Helena, there are a couple of questions that we've received which are clarifications around the taxonomy. Some of them should be covered by Brenda's presentation, but I was wondering if you could answer a quick clarification.
Sure.
So the first question is asking about the activity level of the taxonomy. So we've described the taxonomy as being about activity level, but is it actually distinguishing within certain activities if a certain way of executing that activity is sustainable? And the example given is airlines. Obviously, airlines are not something that have been considered in scope for the taxonomy so far, so maybe we want to take another example, but the example given is if we say flying is unsustainable, do we say flying is unsustainable, or do we say if you fly with a very efficient airline, that's sustainable? I was wondering if you could comment on this question for us.
Okay, I think it's a hard example, but let me think about a different one. In fact, what the taxonomy would say, if you think about at the very beginning when I showed there were 6 environmental objectives, yeah? So we will go environmental objective per environmental objective. So in this case, we're only looking at mitigation, yeah? So the question would be, is that activity, yeah, actually, demonstrates substantial avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions? Yes or no, yeah? And that it's a yes or no answer in the sense of could it be? And then if so, what is the right metric? And once we have the right metric, then when the nuance comes in, is saying, okay, under which circumstances in the sense of how many greenhouse gas emissions is that activity going to emit, and where do we put the barrier? So under how many greenhouse gas emissions we think is or carbon intensity, to be precise, do we think that is the most environmental sustainable, and from which we're going to consider an activity environmental sustainable. So in the case, imagine we were looking at actually at flying, which we are not, then we would say X grams of CO2 per kilometer run, and then we will establish the threshold. So then, in that case, you can look at your airline, and that type of plane, and say, okay, does that airline, carbon intensity meet or not our threshold? But as Alyssa said, we're not looking into airlines.
Perfect. Okay, I have one additional question that I thought would be useful to cover now. There are a couple of other questions which I think will be covered by your presentation, Brenda. But we've had a couple of questions about the relationship between the SDGs and the taxonomy. And I wanted to answer this one, but also I'll give my panelists an opportunity to comment as well. My understanding is that the early technical development of the taxonomy is designed to be very closely linked to existing operational taxonomies that people are already using in the market. And the sense was that these were most developed in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so the intent longer term is to broaden the taxonomy to cover social issues. And in fact, there are some proposals from some of the member states in the overarching regulation to include a more explicit reference to the SDGs. But in a purely technical sense, the scope has been narrowed in this initial phase, really to make it as actionable and practical as possible in the short term. Brenda, Helena, would you like to add anything to that question, or shall we carry on with the presentation?
No, I think we can carry on with the presentation.
Perfect. Brenda, would you like to carry on?
So what I would want to do is take you through how do we get through these activities and the actual metrics and thresholds that we're defining, to give you a bit of a feeling of what is the work that we're doing in the technical expert group. And I'm currently myself leading the work on transport, so I'll take it from that sector, but it's basically the same methodology applied for all of the sectors that we're analyzing. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. So, I told you transport. So what we've done to start with is we needed to make a selection of sectors that could really have an impact on the climate mitigation. Well, what you see here is an EEA trends and projections report, where you actually see that there are 5 main emitting sectors, and you'll see that these sectors also represent a large chunk of the work that we're doing with the tag. You also see that transport, and this is excluding aviation, it is mainly one of the, is the highest emitting sector, and therefore also a sector that, if we are able to reduce the CO2 emissions from that sector, could substantially contribute to reaching the Paris Climate Agreement goals. Can I have the next slide, please? So basically, once we selected the sectors and we said we take on board transport as an important sector, and there's already quite a lot of work being done, we've looked at the division of emissions within that sector to define where we would start with. So what we did is we started with road transport. As you see here, that's a large share of the mitigations. The large share of the emissions. So potentially also a place where we could reduce emissions and get substantial gains. The other sector that we looked at is railways, and as you see in the diagram, that's not necessarily a high emitting sector, but we have decided to take it on board because it has high potential for modal shift, which means basically if you develop rail in a good way, people would use rail instead of aviation or car transport, and therefore we could reduce emissions overall. So what we've done in the first round, if we started with these 2 sectors, and maybe I can have the next slide. Basically, we follow the same 3 steps for every activity. So what we do, as you've probably heard, but it's I think good to share again, is that we are using the NACE code, which is the European classification system for economic activities, a system that is also used by all of the European agencies and the national governments. Now, I know that most of the investors, including ourselves, are not familiar with this system, which has caused some discussion also in our working group. I think where we are now is that we've decided to work with NACE as mainly the governments will be the first ones that are obliged to work with this taxonomy. However, what we'll do in the tag is look at the translation system towards the declassification systems that are common to us as investors and banks. So think about GIGS or BICS or any other 6 categories that we would classify our activities in. So once we've defined those codes, and often within a code, there's still scope for several activities. So we really looked at all of the descriptions and looked at whether we had to change the scope for a certain activity. And the second one is the criteria. So what we did is basically we compiled the existing material and legislation. I think legislation is an important part. Obviously, all the work that we do will need to be in line with what's already there on European policy guidance and legislation. And for transport, that's quite a lot. So we do use this as basically like the base scenario, the very bare minimum that we would have to ask. Probably, if this legislation has not been brought in line with the 2030 climate goals, the thresholds will be a bit higher than what's now written into legislation. Then also there's existing material from market parties such as climate bonds initiatives, PGGM and APG that have developed a taxonomy, BNP Paribas, the European Investment Bank. So basically we compiled all of these best practices to see where is the overlap and how can we bring this together in one framework, basically develop this dictionary that Helena was speaking about. And then once we have that, so we have a clear scope of what we're going to do, and we know what the methodology is that is mostly used or that is best practice for every activity, we start looking at the thresholds and the criteria. So that basically means, okay, if we look at this activity, what are the metrics that we would have to look at? For climate mitigation, that's most of the time that would be something related to GHG emissions and the reduction of that. And then we would look at thresholds for that. So that basically means looking at when is a car, like what is a CO2 emission that is acceptable for cars now and probably also in the future. Maybe to give you a feeling for what our challenges were, because this looks quite an easy process, but obviously it's a challenge to align all the existing practices in the market and get everyone on board with one single methodology. I think we're quite well on the way doing that. It's not always easy to find evidence to define the thresholds and pathways, because you'd have to think of 2030 and potentially also 2050, as the long-term strategy for the Commission is focused on 2050. And not for every activity you would have a clear pathway of how emission reduction would have to look for that sector. So we reach out to academic research and experts in the market to get a better feeling of that. And then there's basically the defining of the borders of the activity. So where does a car operation basically end in energy supply or manufacturing? So we clearly have to define the scope in such a way that all the activities are captured in one sector or the other. Can I have the next slide, please? So here, so Helena just shows you already also an example. This is an example also for passenger rail transport. And on the left, you'll see the questions that we are asking in the feedback round, and you've still the chance to react to that until next Friday. So what you'll see is basically the steps that I just described. So sector classification and activity. So this is transport, NACE level 4, the NACE code, and a short description of the categories, where we could also exclude like small activities that are in NACE but are not necessarily relevant to our work. Then we're looking at the mitigation criteria. So what is the principle? As I said, for most climate mitigation activities, that is to demonstrate substantial GHG emission reductions. The second one is the metric. That depends on the kind of thing they were looking at. For rail transport, we use CO2 emissions per passenger per kilometer. For freight, that is obviously not passenger, but it's tons. So that differs per activity. Then we set thresholds. Well, actually, we're still working on that. As you'll see in this document, we haven't been able to find sufficient research yet to come up with actual thresholds for CO2 emissions from trains. What we have done is said that zero direct emissions rail and fleet is eligible. And it's important to note that that is with the European market in mind. So what we've looked at is basically how does the energy mix work, look in the European Union the coming years, what are the scenarios, and based on that scenario, can we assume that electric rail is actually better than other modes of rail? Realizing that, when you charge a car or an electric train with coal energy, that is not necessarily sustainable. So it's something that's still open is how do we look at this in other geographic areas? Would we want to expand the taxonomy to a worldwide framework? Can I have the next one? Yeah, so this is an example from energy. It's a bit different, but it's I think interesting to see. Here we have been able to set a threshold, namely GHG from electricity generation for geothermal activity is 120 grams CO2 per kilowatt hour. How have we done that? We've basically looked at the average at this point in time of geothermal energy plants. That the average is currently at 123 grams, and we've rounded that up to 125. Noting that would not classify all of geothermal plants currently being operated. Another notion is that we're seeing that the expected emissions from these plants will reduce. So we are also thinking about how to create kind of decreasing thresholds over time when we move towards these 2030 goals. Another assessment that you'll see also in transport, energy, and basically every activity is the do no significant harm assessment. The Commission has clearly set out in the legislation that for every activity that we identify, we have to make sure that none of the other objectives is being significantly harmed. And this is a separate work stream actually within the technical expert group that is doing this work for every taxonomy and setting up the methodology for that. And this has turned out to be a really big effort, but it's very useful when you realize that you can have a positive effect on the other side, but you should make sure that on the other activities you're not actually doing a lot of harm. So what you'll see here is, minimize consequences on local water quality for geothermal, minimize pollution, take care of ecosystems. It's basically comparable with an analysis we also do as an investor when we are assessing ESG risks. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, so I think I saw some questions as well on this. So how do you get from activity level to company level? And it's probably good to start by saying that the Commission is not, at this point in time, not intending to give any obligation of classifying companies. So a certain revenue percentage of a company that has to be green before you classify the company as green. What you would have to do if you are building a fund or analyzing a company, you basically start with identifying the percentage of activities in that company that is related to potential green activities. So basically the activities that you think are green. Then you would have to look at, do the activities qualify? Does it qualify automatically? So, for example, electric rail. If not, what are the CO2 emissions, and are these below the identified thresholds? And then as a last check, you would have to do activities. You would have to make sure that they pass on the do no significant harm assessment. To give you a bit of a feeling, I think, from the sectors that I've been talking about. So basically, if you'd look at Tesla, that would be 100% electric vehicle producer, and you would probably identify almost 100% of the activities related to potential green activities. If you'd look at BMW, the German car manufacturer who has recently produced the i3, you'd probably look at the production percentage of the revenues or production facility that is used for this type of car, and that percentage you could count as green. Same goes, for example, if you look in the energy sector for a company like Fiestas, which would be almost 100% green, against GE, General Electric, which has windmills, but it's a relatively smaller part of the revenues of the company. However, if you look at market share, you could still say that it's quite influential. And this assessment will still be part of your own assessment that you will have to make as an investment company. Can I have the next slide? I think this was my part, and I'm going to hand over to Helena indeed to give you a bit of better feeling of how this would then work through your funds, basically.
I'll just hand over presenter rights to Helena. Helena, just to let you know, we've had a lot of questions about this, and people are very keen to get into the detail here.
Perfect. Thank you. So I hope you can see the details of these slides, because basically what Brenda has presented, particularly the last slide that she talked about, it is really about how we will then assess a company, and how we will determine, which percentage of the company's turnover actually complies with the taxonomy. So what you will have in practice is this dictionary. So it's on the bottom of your slide. You have the taxonomy. You will have the taxonomy compliant activities. You will have your dictionary on one hand, and then you will have all the rest of activities that simply have not been classified. As I said, that doesn't mean that they are necessarily brown or not green. They might be, like the case of education, medicines, and so many other activities that they're simply not being classified as environmentally sustainable per se, or contributing to an environmentally objectives. So you will then have to do what we do, all of us, when constructing a green fund or environmental fund. So you would have all the different companies, stocks. You will have to look at which percentage of those of the company's activities actually comply with the taxonomy. So you have two examples, company A and company B. The first one is 60%, the second one is 20%. And once you have determined that, you will then go and construct your portfolio. So you would have different companies that will have different percentage of their turnover responding to the taxonomy. And then depending on the weighting of each company, you will then be able to calculate the percentage of the fund that is compliant with the taxonomy. And this is very important, because the only thing the current legal proposal obliges to is that if you want to call your fund green or environmentally sustainable, then you will have to disclose which percentage of that fund actually relates to the taxonomy. When we look at current green labels, like the Lux flag, for instance, or the tech, actually it's called tech as well, but with the C at the end, label in front, you also have to do that. So calculate the percentage, of the fund that responds to the activities. The only difference is that you use your own taxonomy, and you need to explain to the label provider, what does this entitle and what is your methodology. And this is what I call the taxonomy in practice. So what you have in front of you, it is the 5 key questions that we are asking you, we as the tech, as part of our consultation. As Alyssa and Brenda mentioned, we are undergoing the first consultation on the first round of activities. The consultation implies 2 things. On one hand is the consultation on the actual activities. So for each activity that we have already defined, the principles, the thresholds that do not harm, you have a list of questions. So if you are interested in specific and you have expertise in a specific activity, please do look at those. But personally, I think that for this audience, for PRI members, the most important of all questions are about the usability. This is your moment, your opportunity to get back to us, to tell us what are your concerns or actually what you really like about the taxonomy. So in a nutshell, the key questions are around the use, how useful do you think the taxonomy is and why, or if you think it could be even more useful, please let us know how we can do that. Secondly, it's around the practical challenges that you foresee in applying, yes, when investing and in a portfolio construction, but also we're very keen to hear about other financial products. So from project financing to corporate financing and so forth, and particularly looking at maybe more structured funds, other type of financial products that might be affected. And last but not least, we seriously believe that, grossly speaking, the taxonomy will save us a lot of time and cost, but there will be an implementation period, and we're very much aware that the data availability out there as of today is not the greatest, and that's something that we have already worked on. That's why within the climate-related disclosures guidelines that the tech that we have also developed, there are specific indicators that relate to the taxonomy, namely for companies to disclose the percentage of their turnover that is compliant with the taxonomy. We're also asking about CapEx investments related to that taxonomy, as we think a forward-looking indicator is really important as well for investors. And with that, I think I hand over to you, Alyssa, and we're looking forward to answer all the questions you may have. And please, please, please do answer on the consultation. Please let us know, what your thinking is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena. We've got a request to go back to the taxonomy in practice slide. So I'm just going to put that up on the screen while we do some questions. We've had loads of questions today, so unfortunately we're not going to get to all of them. We will be recording a list of all questions, and we will be reaching out directly for any that we haven't been able to answer. And my contact details will be on the screen at the end, so if there are any questions that you wanted to ask but haven't had the opportunity or feel we've ignored, please do feel free to reach out directly. So, Brenda, we have a couple of questions on the transport example. I'm going to introduce 3 sets of questions, one for Brenda, one for Helena, and one for me. I'll give you guys a minute to just think through while I answer the 2 that I've assigned to myself, and then I'll come back to you. So, Brenda, we've been asked about the criteria for automatic qualification. So giving the example of transport where you've taken 0 tailpipe emissions, what was the thinking there? And we've also had some questions about how you're defining do no significant harm and whether the criteria need to be developed further or whether they are currently they're quite high level, how they might be developed further to avoid distortions or sort of imbalances in the way that do no significant harm is being assessed. So I'll come back to you in a moment. Helena, I'd like you to answer a question about data, which I know is one that you have some preformed views on, but we've had quite a few questions about where the data is supposed to come from, what type of data people are going to be able to access. And then in terms of questions for me, I've had a couple of questions about how this actually has to be used and the relationship between this and Ecolabels. So in terms of the overall legislation or regulation, that sits outside of the scope of the technical expert group work, but it does set the actual requirements for investors to use the taxonomy, and the current requirement is that investors who market a product as environmentally sustainable should make reference to the taxonomy in explaining how that product is sustainable. So it's not a requirement to only invest in taxonomy compliant activities, but it is a requirement to make reference to if and how you've considered taxonomy compliant activities when developing your product. We've had some questions about whether this is fair or consistent, or whether a taxonomy disclosure requirement might be more applicable across the whole market. My answer to this is that this is an issue for the overarching regulation, so it's not one that we can answer today. But if you are engaging directly with the European Parliament or the Council and would like to be in touch about the PRI's own engagement on this, please do reach out to me and we can have a conversation. I'm very happy to share some of the current discussions that we're aware of. The other question we've had is about eco-labels. And I think it's worth mentioning that the sort of two proposed uses of the taxonomy are the investor use that we've mentioned, and the requirement for member states who publish eco-labels to also reference the taxonomy. So we understand that that's the mandatory relationship as it's currently proposed between the taxonomy and eco-labels. But beyond that, I think it is still optional for market-based eco-labels to decide if and how they want to use the taxonomy. And I thought it's also worth mentioning that the green bond standard that we mentioned as part of the taxonomy work, part of the technical expert group work, will also make reference to the taxonomy when determining what qualifies as a green bond according to that standard. But that is a voluntary standard, so that's not a mandatory use of the taxonomy. Brenda, can I now pass over to you to get your response on the questions around automatic qualification and on do no significant harm?
Yeah. Sure. So automatic qualification at this point we've said is only zero direct emissions. We've chosen direct emissions because, well, that has to do with data availability. We don't have any possibility at this point in time to measure, for example, well-to-wheel or tank-to-wheel emissions. So we are focusing on direct emissions where it comes to thresholds, and also direct qualification, which is basically if you have no emissions, you would directly qualify. I think the second one was on do no significant harm, Alyssa, right?
That's correct.
I would say, especially for transport, but I know there's some other sectors that this is being developed. So really the points that you see in our round one documentation are quite high level, and we're really working hard to specify these more and give them a bit more substance. So this is really a first draft high level principles that we could think of. And as I said, there we have installed an additional group, well, basically a separate working stream on do no significant harm criteria that work on this methodology throughout all of the sectors that we're looking at.
Perfect, thank you. Helena, could I come to you to comment on data availability, please?
Yes, definitely. But if I may, I would like to make a very quick comment around Ecolabels. Yeah, just to say that it will be the Ecolabel, in this case, the European Ecolabel, that will establish, the threshold of like which percent, for instance, it might do it, it might not, which percentage of the fund, of your fund needs to be taxonomy compliant in order to receive the label. It would also be the label who will discuss what type of minimum ESG practices all the companies within that fund need to comply with. But more importantly, and now I'm talking about BNP Paribas and management, we're quite concerned about the multiplicity of labels that they are appearing across Europe. We think that they go against the spirit of the EC Action Plan, in the sense that what we really want is to foster and to promote investments, this type of investments. We need to facilitate those also inter-country, so that So what we need is a range of European labels instead of different labels that establish different thresholds or different requirements in each member state. That said, talking about data. What we need to think about the taxonomy is that it's dynamic, not only in the sense of that it needs to constantly be updated, but it's also dynamic in the sense of its application and the implementation. So this is not like on 1st of January 2020, that's it, you know. It is a process. We're very much aware that the number one barrier to apply it is the data availability. However, we are working hard to see how best to overcome it and how to accelerate what inevitably one day, you know, will be available because of both because of the regulation. I already talked about the climate-related disclosures guidelines, but also because of the incentive that companies have to disclose and will have to disclose that type of information. Now, the climate-related disclosures guidelines are, as of today, voluntary. The non-financial reporting directive has been very recently came into force, and unfortunately, it cannot be made compulsory, the guidelines, in the next year or so. That said, many of us were already advocating for them to become compulsory as soon as possible, and we're looking at 2021. But even if, you know, it becomes compulsory for European companies to disclose in relation to the taxonomy, still there is a question mark about what would happen with non-European companies on one hand, but also with those smaller companies and private companies that they are not under the scope of the non-financial reporting directive. And this is why this is the area that we're working on how to make how to incentivize all companies to disclose. I think investors, we have a key role to play in here, and the same way that today we have progressed so much when it comes to asking companies for climate-related disclosures, and yet, despite the effort, we're still a long way. We have brilliant initiatives. Some have come out from the PRI, the Climate Action 100+. I foresee investors actually really putting pressure on companies to disclose along the lines of the taxonomy. There's also, you also have to take into account that the most difficulties, as I said, it will be for non-European and smaller companies, and when it comes to equity funds, because for project financing, corporate financing, and other financial products, it will be much easier given the special relationship with the companies. I think I'm going to leave it there and just say that research providers will obviously play a key role in helping or in improving that data availability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena. I'm conscious that we've gone just 1 minute over, which I think is a function of the huge number of questions we've received. So thank you, everybody, for participating. My contact details are on the screen if you'd like to be in touch about any element of the PRI's European Policy Programme. We will be circulating a recording of this webinar as well as a copy of the slides. And just to mention that we will try and endeavour to keep you updated with our policy activities through the PRI's monthly policy briefing. So thank you all very much for joining, and I think we'll close the webinar there.